All right, hey everybody. So this is Josh Bruce, and this is going to be the beginning of a new project. I'm not really sure what to call it, so I think we're probably going to call it Amos. Now, and we'll get into why here in a minute. But first, I wanted to talk about what challenge we're going to sort of be playing with, right? So basically, you have what's called the clean architecture. It was, coined by Uncle Bob Martin. And there's a lot of different names for previous iterations, and Bob does a good job of listing them out. Hexagonal architecture, onion architecture, um, ports and adapters is another one. But basically, the idea is that each of these concentric circles, so entities, use cases, controllers, gateways or presenters, and then the web, the devices, basically the I/O, um, they are not. Let's actually let Bob explain it. So, um, each of these architectures produce systems that are independent of frameworks, right? They're testable, independent of the UI, independent of database, independent of any external agency. And so he talks about the dependency rule, and basically the dependency rule is that stuff on the outside can be dependent on stuff on the inside, but things on the inside should be independent of the things on the outside as much as possible, right? So entities, which is the inner core, is what Bob calls the enterprise-wide business rules. An entity can be an object with methods or anything like that, but if yeah, that's pretty much it. The use cases are actually specific to the application, right? So the second ring are things that are specific to the application itself, right? So if we have certain rules governing the way what users can and cannot see, that's sort of what the use case area is kind of for. And then you have controllers. Let's see what Bob says about controllers, which are interface adapters. Software in this layer is a set of adapters that convert data from the format most convenient for the use cases and entities to the format most convenient for some external agency, such as the database or the web. So basically, if we have, say, a string inside the middle portion, but the use case, and the use case uses that string and manipulates it, but the device or the database or the web on the outside needs it to be an integer or an array, the controller sort of handles that conversion. Okay, at least if I'm understanding that correctly. Could be wrong. And so the outermost layer is generally composed of frameworks, right? So what's interesting about this model is that it describes a desire with regard to interactions and things like that, but I don't think it actually describes or illustrates sort of the reality, at least from my perspective and experience, of how these things actually interact. And Uncle Bob has a lot of different, or rather, at least one well-known talk, or well-known to me, one well-known talk on clean architecture when he talks about frameworks, and that basically what happens is frameworks kind of stab themselves into a bunch of different areas of your website. So the challenge that we have, or that I've set for myself and us, is we're going to use a framework, right? In this case, it's going to be Laravel, but we are going to try to make it in such a way that it is not actually completely dependent on the framework, right? So, because the idea is that we can switch a lot of this stuff out without it being a problem, right? You can switch out the outer ring, or you should be able to switch out the outer ring a lot easier than you can that innermost ring. And basically, each time you go farther in, it becomes more difficult to switch out, but it should not be impossible. So let's go ahead and open Keynote. I'm going to create a brand new presentation, and going to delete those text boxes. Now, this needs to be a lot larger. And I still haven't found a modeling tool for Mac OS that I like. So if you have one and you'd like to see about me using it, then we can totally do that. So just let me know. 1536. So 1536. Can it make a slide that big? It looks like it can. All right. So what are we going to do? Well, first we're going to zoom out. And I'm looking for a cone shape. All right, let's use the traffic cone. Why not? All right, so we have the traffic cone. How does Keynote do rotation right command? And then you can hold down shift and it'll snap. All right, so we have our traffic cone. And I actually think we can just keep making this a little bit bigger. Oh, wait. Let's make it just a little bit smaller. All right, so traffic cone, right on. How are we going to format the traffic cone? We are going to say fill is, hey, fill, like the groundhog. Yeah, like the groundhog. So line, and we're going to, oh, I don't have my colors. Ah, that sucks. Okay. So let's make it gray, and okay, well, I guess it's already kind of where I want it to be then. All right, so this is kind of, it's kind of like if we spun this out, right? Like, so like this is looking down into the cone. And what we're doing is we're starting to look at it from the side, okay? The outer ring is still the outer ring, so things that are toward or that are away from the edges, that's where we're actually going to be. So let's go ahead and sort of indicate that. I think we're going to use, let's go ahead and use an arrow. That arrow. Right? And so basically what we're saying is, so this is the dependency rule. And I still haven't read Bob's book on clean architecture. It's on my list. All right, so now that looks roughly center. Let's go ahead and add those. Arrange, distribute objects vertically. There we go. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that anything that we have on the inside toward this center here, its dependency arrow goes, it has the dependency arrows pointing at it, not out. And I'm not going to think about this too much. Like, I don't want to overthink this. All right. So what we're going to build is also, like, this is, and I prefer to build things that are actually legit. So this is actually, I think, going to be the architecture and some of the code for the latest version of Eightfold and the apps that are inside of it, as well as another project that I'm working on. So I'm not just going to recreate this, but we have the web, and we know that should be, and I'm actually, Yeah, let's do this. So I copy paste that, turn this around, and what we're going to say here, right, because we have all this zoom space, right, so let's go ahead and use it. Text, and because just to give you an idea, that's a 48-point font, right? So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say volatility, because when I first heard Bob talking about everything, this is kind of where my head went. Or rather, it might have been somebody else when they were talking about the ports and adapters architecture, which is basically that the most volatile layers are on the outside, your most stable layers are on the inside. And so let's go ahead and make that left align, and we're going to say low volatility, right? So this is where all of our data objects is going to go. Data objects are going to go. This is also where the data in the database is going to be stored. So we got to make sure that when we create the database fields and everything like that, that we're sort of capturing the proper meta data and that sort of a thing. But as we go up, we're going to go farther and farther away from the data and its architecture to the UI, and because the UI can change all sorts of ways. Now, funny enough, we're going to call this inner dependence. Right, so the dependency rule. And so I was on a project or a program once, and I mentioned this concept of the UI being volatile, whereas the data is not. And this database, engineer or database architect was just like, "Oh, no, 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 no!" Like she honestly felt sort of insulted, um, and there is something to be said for that. And because what she was seeing is the database is not stable ever, right? And the UI was stable, right? Like the UI, you should hit a point, and it stops changing. And I was like, wow, okay. And so we had this, really mutually enlightening conversation, and sort of came to the conclusion that what it was is that we were talking about two different things. What I consider to be a stable, or the reason that I say that the database is stable, is that if you have if you have identified the fields and the tables are laid out in a certain type of way, and so on and so forth, then basically you shouldn't have to change the actual architecture of the database that much, right? Like changes can happen and you might do some things. And when I say not that much is that basically you're not able to, or you don't want to, or you don't have to change it every week, right? In the beginning, maybe, and we'll probably have to do that with this project. But and what she was talking about with the UI and why the data felt alive to her was because the data was constantly changing, right? The data that was being stored was constantly changing because users were entering new data and deleting old data and doing all these things. It was alive. It was a living, breathing thing. And meanwhile, for the UI, at least in her eyes, it didn't change. It was pretty much the same for every user. You know, that button was always going to be that button, and it was always going to be in the same place, and so on and so forth. And then I was like, well, you know, now I'm getting kind of insulted because that's not the way the UI works. And so, anyhow, all that to say, basically, that I still kind of look at things as though it's a volatility scale going up and down. So basically, in this type of architecture, and so basically, when we say that we're going to have a UI, then yeah, I'm going to put in here, if I can, UI, right? That goes up here. Fair enough? Now, this volatility scale also runs left to right. Well, is it the volatility scale? Now I'm starting to argue with myself, but the point being is that over here we have low volatility and control, right? And we'll work on this architecture or this model as we keep going, but I just need something that can give me an idea for where stuff needs to go. So, for example, when it comes to a database, we can put it over here. This is starting to feel confusing even to me. But that's what we're trying to do, right? Is basically figure out where stuff needs to go. So devices, external interfaces. So for Bob, I'm assuming that when I say that we use, or rather, yeah, so let's just do external interface. Might have to make this whole thing smaller. I think trying to use this cone was maybe a little too much. And I also think maybe holding on to this is a little too much, the 4 colors. So let's try something else. All right, here's the deal. So we have Laravel. All right, Laravel is going to be our framework. Now, the thing about Laravel and why I chose to use it the first time was actually because it allowed me to create my own database schemas, right? Because basically one of the limitations that I are one of the things I consider to be a limitation of the others, or some of the others, is the inability to create a database, right? Like they dictate what your database is going to look like. Now, Laravel also has models, right? And just to get these squares to be smaller, I'm going to move this up here and just call it Laravel. And that way we can delete here. Database schema and migration. So Laravel allows us to basically create whatever tables we want, whatever fields we want, whatever. Doesn't matter. And so, and we'll call that, yeah, let's call that eightfold. So, copy paste. So this is going to be the eightfold specific stuff, right? Because part of this architecture is to have a is to get your own code isolated from the code of somebody else. Kind of. That's a really interesting way of saying it, I guess. So anyway, so Laravel is going to create our database migrations, like the fields and everything like that. And so this sort of follows that dependency chain in both axes, right? So like if this was a funnel, it would literally, the volatility would reduce and reduce and reduce, not only along this x-axis as depicted by Uncle Bob, but it would also decrease as things go further in. So database schema and migration, it has models, right? Which these are the entities from the Uncle Bob model. Then it also has the controller layer, so the thing that's going to actually translate, in some cases, the way these models get passed to the UI layer, which Laravel also has covered, right? But the main reason that I chose Laravel, or at least one of the main reasons, was the database schema. I could make it up myself. The UI layer I could actually throw out. I wasn't dependent on their template engine. So for example, WordPress used to be like this, but I'm not sure if it's like this now. But to be able to bring the WordPress data into your templates in WordPress, you have to use the WordPress sort of post object, right? And so it's kind of, it's done basically in the spirit of PHP original, right? Which is, there's a language over there that you basically tap into and can get the data and pull it across, right? And what I see a lot of times is basically we start getting into this point where we're questioning which direction this blade thing needs to go, right? So I've seen people in their blade templates make database queries off of their models, right? Because models are basically, they're data objects, but they're also query objects. And so that's sort of where this comes from. And so Blade will take a data object and end up making database queries, right? Which is the purpose of the controller. So what we want to make sure of is that basically, so we talk about the dependency being this way. Well, the way that it unfurls goes this way, right? So the objects, and maybe that's breaking that dependency rule, right? Because Blade is, well, no, Blade is dependent on the controller is dependent on the models, and the model is dependent on the database schema and migrations, which is dependent on the actual database. And so it gets returned back up the chain, just sort of the way that it goes. And so now let's go take a look at this real quick. So where do the use cases live and where are the controllers? Well, if this is the 4 steps of this architecture, then this is it. The models and controllers. Those are the entities and whatnots. So I'm actually going to move this down here, because it's not that those things are dependent on one another, it's that this thing actually just makes that happen. So let's go ahead and do this. And because we need more room. And I'm going to make this a 2-liner. go ahead and make it a little bit more narrow. So for us, for Eightfold, we basically are going to have a MySQL database. And mainly it's because that's what PHP has. That's kind of what I know. But the objective here is actually not to really use it. This is here, from experiments that I've run so far, this database is here mainly for taking advantage of some of the things that Laravel gives us for free, primarily authentication. So, all right, we have models, which are in Laravel, but I don't want my business rules inside of those models, right? So what I want to do is I actually want to, I think, have the entities for Eightfold that hold all of the business logic and things like that. And it's not that they're going to inherit from these, right? So we're not talking class inheritance here. What we're saying is that basically it's going to depend on that model, okay? And so the model, and the models actually do database queries. They don't have to, but and remember, like, the idea here is that we're doing this to minimize how much original development that we have to do so that we can get spun up quickly, but it's also to say that we're not going to be dependent on, Laravel for everything. All right, so now we have these controllers, and I think we should be okay, because this is about to get really awkward really fast. So I think the controllers should be fine, okay? And they are basically going to be leveraging the entities, right? So controllers leverage entities, entities leverage models, models leverage the database schema, and migrations occur in an outside process. Now, when it comes to Blade, as far as template engines go and syntax goes, I think that Blade is a fine thing. I personally am still experimenting with not using it, like avoiding it entirely, because again, I don't want to be, I would like to be able to throw all the yellow/orange boxes out, all the Laravel boxes. I wish I had like the actual Laravel orange. Like, that's closer. So basically, want to be able to, well, maybe that's harsh. I don't want to be able to throw everything out, everything in orange out. What I want to be able to do is I want to be able to take everything in teal and move it somewhere else. Right? I want to be able to put it into another system, even if that means porting over my entities. And so the model objects become true data objects, where like their whole purpose in life is to deal with data, right? If I want to save changes, I save the model. If I want to get an updated field, I update the model, right? Like that sort of a thing. So anyway, Blade is nice insofar as it goes. I think it still has the same limitations that we've been talking about with PHP forever, which is hypertext preprocessing, right? So And what I mean by that is that basically one of PHP's fundamental functions and purposes in life is to grab an HTML document, well, a .php file, and that could contain nothing but HTML, and then parse that HTML, find scripts that it can then use to get data to inject into those HTML elements, right? Like that goes all the way back to PHP's original design. It was a template engine, not a language. Um, and so, but then we had this argument and this big debate in the community about basically get your PHP out of my HTML or get your PHP out of your HTML. And so what ended up happening is I started looking at it and thinking about it for a minute, and I was like, no, that's not actually the problem. Right? And I think I mentioned this in another video, but I was like, that may not be the actual problem. What if I flipped it and the problem was actually that we needed to get the HTML out of our PHP, right? And so basically, if you open up a PHP file, it should look like PHP. It should not mimic HTML at all, right? Because one of the things that, and it's not a performance hit that's maybe big enough to talk about, and I haven't actually measured it, but basically, but there has to be a performance hit. If so, a request comes in, the server grabs the file that was requested. It finds out that it's a .php file. It spins up PHP to wrap around that file to go ahead and execute it. Then we do all this logic and stuff right inside of Laravel and any other framework for that matter. And then what we're going to do, because we don't want PHP tokens inside of our HTML, right? Like the problem is the left angle bracket question mark PHP. Like get all of those out of your HTML. So even if we write a syntax like Blade that just gets rid of those tokens for us, then we feel better, right? And replaces them with something else. But it adds a layer of parsing, right? So in old school days, right, .php would launch, you would have HTML, it would have PHP tokens inside of it, PHP would parse it, find the tokens, and it would run the logic, and then flip the stream, the HTML stream back over to the server, and the server goes, all right, cool, we're done, and we're going to send that back, right? So that's one parse, and we've already had to launch PHP. Now, when it comes to these template engines that exist for various things, like WordPress and Laravel and everything else, we're now doing that step again, right? Because instead of letting PHP parse it, our framework is going to parse it. So Blade has to parse this template, and it's going to do a conversion, basically, right, from its syntax into HTML with PHP tokens inside of it, right? So if you have a p tag, and inside that p tag it's got curly brace, some variable name, yeah, that's really nice to read. Having said that, when Blade parses it, it parses it into left angle bracket question mark PHP space echo. It does some stripping of the special characters and things like that. And then there's a variable, and then there's a semicolon, and then there's a question mark and a left angle bracket. So all of those Blade templates basically get converted into old school PHP HTML templates. But I guess it's nice because we don't have to look at it that way. And then PHP still parses that file and executes whatever's in the tokens that remain, and then it hands it over to the server. So anyway, I ran that experiment and I thought about it for a while, and basically what I came up with is, for Eightfold, is two libraries. One is Eightfold Component, and the other is Eightfold Elements are entities. And what it does is it effectively, well, not effectively, literally, what it does is it basically gets rid of the HTML, but it outputs HTML. And so all of a sudden, instead of Blade having to parse a really convoluted page template into PHP, which then gets parsed into straight HTML, which then gets sent via the server. I have Blade that basically calls one method on a return object, which is this sort of stack, this functional stack of, or this stack of functions that generates all the HTML that I need. And then basically it gets there and Blade looks at it and parses it, and it's just HTML. There are no tokens. There are no syntactic sugar elements that it needs to deal with. So it hands it to PHP. PHP looks at it and sees that there aren't any PHP tokens inside that HTML and hands it over to the server, and the server sends it back. So I have noticed that it is a little bit faster. But I haven't actually tested like the difference, right? Because I know moving from PHP 5 to 7 is going to make a difference anyway. But I tell you what, when I built the website to sort of showcase component and entities, it was intense. Basically, every time I refreshed, even if it was while holding down Shift to make sure that it wasn't using a cache or anything, it basically took less than a second, right? So, and my target for page load times is always roughly 3 seconds or less on a mobile device. Not saying I can always get there, but Anyhow, so component and entities coming with me. I still haven't used it enough to really work out all the kinks at this point. Of how it should be used, but this is what we've got. And so instead of, right, you can see where we have Blade, which is Laravel. So basically it goes Laravel 8-fold, Laravel 8-fold, Laravel 8-fold. And it's to maintain and hold on to the stuff that is really, really important, at least in my brain, is we've got... so we have the entities. We can call entities and use cases. Yeah, there we go. Okay, that was awkward. Entities and use cases. Right, so we have the entities and the use cases, and that's 8-fold. That's just 8-fold code. Now, we can make the argument that it's dependent on these models, and there is some validity to that, but the idea is that the models, we work them in such a way that they don't do anything, right? There's only getting stuff out of them. So we should be okay. And then we have the controllers and gateways, which, that is a little bit specific, and that's because of, we're going to be using Laravel's router, which is directly tied into sort of the controller side of things. All right, so the router's there, goes into the controllers. The controllers grab the entities, or by way of the entities and the use cases, interact with the models that update our persistent store, and then they also, messaging also comes back to the component level. So let's actually add an arrow, make this a double arrow, because that's kind of more how the model view controller thing works. Components and entities are basically going to work on the display, so that's the UI, and then we have Blade, right? But if I could make this proportionally the size that it needs to be, when I've run this experiment before, basically I ended up with a Blade file, so essentially equivalent to index.php, and it literally had one line inside of it, which was pure PHP. Excuse me, because it used a token. And so basically when Blade looked at it, it's like, oh, that's not me. I got nothing. I don't need to run anything here, and it would just pass it straight into PHP to parse. Also, with component and entities, just to throw this out there, one of the things that also I think helps with the performance is that it doesn't add any extraneous white space, right? So the white space that we see in HTML and CSS and JavaScript isn't necessary for the computer. It helps, and probably could be argued that it is necessary for the human to read it, but it's not necessary for the computer. And we've come up with minifiers for CSS, and we've come up with minifiers for JavaScript that make that really compact. And when you remove all the white space from things like CSS and JavaScript, the file size drops by like 50%, 30 to 50%. The same is true for HTML. If you remove all the tabs, right, and all the carriage returns, then yeah, all of a sudden it becomes really, really tiny. But we have to build something that is not a template engine that needs to parse stuff and maintain white space. We need to build something that can minify it. And I thought about, and when you do static websites, if you do static web generators, that might be something that you could run. But the process also doesn't have to take that long, right? Because I think we haven't really gotten into the habit of this before, just from the perspective of we think it's going to take a long time to really process a really long HTML document to strip out all the white space. And so what I did is that instead of getting the HTML with all the white space and stuff like that and then stripping it out, I just never put it in the first place and just generate the whole thing. So anyhow, so that covers Blade, or not Blade. I mean, it does, but so that covers sort of Laravel and Eightfold and how we're going to try to get them to interact, as well as how we are going to try to maintain this sort of dependency concept where nothing on the inside depends on something on the outside. And we're actually going to take it to the extreme. But no, in all seriousness, we're going to kick it up a level because we're going to try to make it so that the entities and use cases that we build with straight Laravel logic and code, or with straight Eightfold logic and code, aren't dependent on the controller and aren't tightly coupled to the point of making it difficult to change out the models. So there's that. And next time, what we're going to do is we're going to sort of add in the third-party services, the external interfaces that Bob's talking about, because I think we've got the entities. We understand where the use cases go. We know where the UI is, so we're going to say UI and UI. Yeah. UI and where the web's going to be and things like that. So according to what Bob's talking about, we should be able to test things like component plus entities in isolation, which we do because it's a library that's completely on the other side of the planet compared to everything else. But the same thing can be said for unities or entities and use cases. And so basically what we should be able to do is we should be able to begin building up these entities and give them the methods and things like that that they need to run certain types of use cases, and be able to do that without Laravel, right? So yeah, anyhow. So next time we're going to talk about third-party services, because Eightfold actually does interface with a lot of these things, and I think that's one of the things with this model is being able to show where those sorts of things are. So with that said, thank you so much for making the time. I definitely do appreciate it, and I'll see you around.